Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that HR is the secret weapon for every organization. This is due in part to its responsibility for planning and strategy surrounding our company's most valuable asset, its people. In order to be our most strategic selves in HR, we need to have access to information and resources to help make the most informed decision possible. And that starts with analytics and metrics, which is what we are focused on today. Today, I'm joined by Natalie McCullough. She's the GM of Workplace Analytics with Microsoft. Natalie, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm excited to be here.
Tell me a little bit more about your background. I've read about it, and I think it's interesting. You can kind of walk listeners through.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with something I'm guessing not very many of your guests say, which is I started my career as a geologist, actually, but I pretty quickly made my way to the tech world. I spent a number of years doing management consulting at McKinsey, helping companies with their growth strategy and their organizational transformations. I then took a turn on the leadership teams of a couple of software and services companies. And several years ago, I joined Microsoft when it acquired Volumetrics, which was an early pioneer in the field of people analytics. So now I am the GM for two products at Microsoft, My Analytics and Workplace Analytics. We think of these as sister products. They leverage the rich behavioral data that's resident in our everyday workplace systems to help us figure out how to do work better. And we do that at all levels, at an individual level, team level, organizational level. The way I like to think about these products is that My Analytics is like a Fitbit for work. It's your personal productivity helper. And Workplace Analytics is an organizational tool that provides aggregated insights across populations. And when used together, they create a powerful system for transformation of work.
Awesome. And so today, in case listeners didn't know, we're talking about people analytics today. So first, before we dive in, can you walk us through a little bit about why people analytics is so important to human resources?
Absolutely. People analytics is the most important strategic development in HR in a very long time. I think personally, I find it really exciting and interesting and a little bit overdue. Historically, companies have invested in measuring just about everything in their business, key operational components. They have a lot of data about customers. They have a lot of information and systems around factory operations, R&D, cash flow, supply chain, real estate utilization, you name it, but not so much about people. People information and people decisions have historically and largely not been very rigorous from a data perspective. So what people analytics does is it takes all of that rigor of data analysis and prediction and research, and it applies it to what everybody says is their most important asset, their people. And it is this use of data about human behavior and relationships and traits that allows organizations, in many cases led by HR, to make better business decisions and enable transformation. And I guess the second piece of your question of why it's so important for HR is that it's important because it allows for higher quality decisions based on that data analysis, prediction, and research rather than anecdotally based decisions, or at worst hierarchical based decisions, or decisions based on risk avoidance. So we're really moving the people space into a place where many other parts of the organization have been for a while, which is around true data-driven decision making.
I really love that we're going this direction because now you can really measure the impact of the human resource function.
Right.
the things that I already know is that it is the secret weapon of the organization. But now you have the data to be able to back up the importance of maybe productivity or different change processes, and certainly putting the right people in the right places at the right time for your organization.
That's right.
You have a interesting HBR, Harvard Business Review article, and we'll put this in the transcript of the podcast, but it talks about transformation. And I don't know if people always link analytics to transformation, but you need the data to be able to help move you forward as part of the change process. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the three types of transformation that you mentioned: cultural, strategic, and process. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. So what we see when we work with companies is that almost every company out there is undergoing some form of transformation. But what we also know is that most transformations fail to achieve their desired objective. And the biggest reason for that failure is because they fail to change human behavior. Changing the way people work and the behaviors that they bring to the workplace is actually the hardest part of a transformation and the core reason behind most transformation failure. So we think of this sort of simplistically speaking. I like to say that the culture is the how of how work gets done, and the strategy is the what of work gets done. So companies are working to change their organizations in both dimensions, sort of the what of what they're doing and the how of how work gets done. And analytics, and specifically people analytics, can play a big role in both of those, as well as process transformation, which I'll hit on in a second. So if you start with culture transformation, this is something that, I feel that almost every single company that I talk to is eagerly trying to adapt or change their culture in one way or another. It's oftentimes to be more nimble, perhaps to be more inclusive with diverse populations, to be more innovative. And people analytics can be a rich source of insight and also a feedback mechanism, a change mechanism to help in those cultural transformations. So maybe to bring it to light with an example. Many companies are faced with this issue around their culture, where if they're trying to become more nimble and innovative, they're held back by historical behaviors around kind of meeting bloat and over collaboration, and this sense that people have that it takes a very long time to get anything done, and it's very hard to be empowered. And what we can do with people analytics is that we can actually really pinpoint where those things are happening in an organization and exactly what the root causes are. And we can take something that goes from sort of anecdotal, water cooler conversation and turn it into something that's really quantified. And once you quantify it and you measure it, then you can start to drive change around it, and you can measure where those things that you're doing are actually creating the change that you want to see. And without the data, you're really operating in the dark around cultural transformation. The second type of transformation that we talk about in that article is strategic transformation, and that's changing the what of what a company is trying to do in the marketplace. And people analytics is also really powerful in the strategic context as well, because it gives you just an incredible new set of insights into what is happening inside of your organization, where your people, your largest investment in resources, are spending their time, and whether that is leading to the business outcomes that you are trying to achieve. So one example of this, to bring this to light, is a company that was using workplace analytics was faced with a commoditization of its market. So this is a pretty serious strategic issue, and they didn't know how they were going to be able to successfully compete in this new market that they were facing. So they utilized the people analytics data assets to understand how their resources were interacting with the market, and to analyze which of those interaction types were actually leading to the success that they needed to drive across their business. And that hard quantified data gave them the courage to change their business model. In this example specifically, they were able to shift from an outside sales field force to an inside sales selling operation, which was more appropriate for the market that they found themselves in, and more effective for their organization. And without the people analytics data, that would have been a very tough decision to make. It would have been more of a gut feel kind of decision that they would have made. The final type of transformation we talk about in the article is a little bit more common, and that's the process transformation. How organizations operate are just full of tons and tons of processes, and process is important, but one of the things that happens with process over time is that they're sort of like magnets. They attract energy and effort to them, sort of like these vortexes of time. And so with people analytics, we can actually create a set of visibility into those processes to understand just how much of a drain they are on the organization, and where there might be opportunities to streamline those processes to free up resources to do higher and better work.
One thing that stuck out as you were talking, and it just keeps sticking with me, but you mentioned over collaboration, which is something that happens all the time, but I haven't ever labeled that. How does that look like in a workforce, and how does that identified maybe in the people analytics that Microsoft provides?
Yeah, I often hear this referred to as collaboration overload, and there is some academic literature about it, but it is almost the easiest conversation to have with employees in an organization. It's like the quickest complaint that people can make, which is, I feel that meetings are not very useful. They're low productivity events. I never have time to do my actual work. There's the common complaint is sort of like, I get home and that's when, I put my kids to bed, and that's when I do my actual work because I spend all day in meetings and emails. So it's that sensibility. And at Microsoft, we've done a lot of research, survey work, as well as the workplace analytics data to really validate that this is a widespread pain that people have. And so one of the really cool things about workplace analytics data is that it just surfaces up so much rich insight about organizational collaboration behaviors. So you can start to look at things like, how much time are people spending in really big or really long meetings? We know from the research and just from, everybody knows that big meetings are not that productive. So anytime you see organizations where the people are spending lots and lots of time in really big or really long meetings, it's a hallmark to say like, hey, there's potentially an issue here. It could be an issue of potentially being an overly collaborative organization from a positive sense, wanting to be very inclusive. It can also be a sign that there are not good systems for sharing information, and that big meetings are the only ways that information gets shared in an organization. Or it can be a sign of something a little bit worse, which is a lack of delegation in an organization, or the feeling that if you go to a meeting with somebody who's senior, you need to bring sort of, every person in the hierarchical chain to that meeting. So we have a lot of rich data that we surface in workplace analytics that can really just paint a picture for what some of those characteristics are and help companies drive a path to change that.
I really love that. And I feel like I never called it over collaboration before, but I think all of us can relate to that time where we feel like we're having meetings about meetings about meetings.
Exactly. Yes.
And I love that now we have data and analytics to arm ourselves that this is in fact happening, and talk about maybe a way to improve our productivity as a team and also as individuals. Can you talk about some more? You had a great example for Microsoft, but one of the things that I love about you guys is that you drink your own champagne. You do what you tell everyone else to do, right? And you're using your products, your technology, your analytics software to help your organization be better and have a better culture and just have better processes and happier and more engaged employees. So talk with me about some more examples maybe of how you guys have used analytics to help transform Microsoft.
Absolutely. We are undergoing a cultural transformation at Microsoft led by our CEO, Satya Nadella, and we have really embraced this data set within our organization. We have dozens of projects that we've deployed across, basically all of our functions internally. Maybe before I tell a couple of those stories, though, I want to put it into the context of what I think is the power of what our specific data is enabling. We talked a little bit earlier about the collaboration overload, but the bigger picture here is that what we're really interested in better understanding and enabling is this zone of knowledge work. And knowledge work is defined as non-repetitive cognitive work. It's arguably the most important and most strategic type of work in the economy today and for businesses today, but it is also the least well understood type of work and the hardest to measure. So if you think about it in contrast, if you think about it, a factory, for example, and the type of work that's happening in a factory, it's pretty straightforward. You quantify your inputs, you quantify your outputs, you have fairly detailed systems that you can optimize and tune and tweak, and you know how to make things better. If you contrast that with knowledge work is really, really different. If I asked somebody to explain why, one legal team was better than another legal team, it would be a very subjective conversation. It would be, a lack of clarity around, is it the pedigree of those individuals? Is it the organizational structure? Is it the leadership model? Is it how they work together, their collaboration norms? It's really almost like knowledge work is sort of like the Wild West of work in terms of being able to treat it scientifically and with managerial science around how to really optimize it. But we think that the key to increasing our understanding lies in this new and exciting and emerging field of people analytics, where we can start to look at all of this behavioral data that's at our fingertips to understand better how work gets done. And the easiest way for us to do that, and what we are pushing hard against, is the data that resides in sort of the everyday systems that people use to get work done, that produce a rich set of data that can be mined and create a picture of work. So we look at metrics that can be really insightful. I talked about some of those meeting metrics earlier, but we also look at things like focus time. So how much time, big blocks of uninterrupted time do people have in a day? For most knowledge work, there needs to be a balance between collaboration and focus. And if you measure focus time and measure how distracted people are during the day, you can use that to understand and improve knowledge work. We also have a nice bead on after hours work. And so that's another thing that knowledge work and companies in general are trying to optimize, is that work-life balance for employees. So how do we have a productive workforce but not overtax our employees? You can use the data to look across silos and inside your organization and understand how teams are working together internally, how externally focused they are, how they're working with partners and customers and suppliers, et cetera. And then you can look at all sorts of norms of behaviors and management practices. So that's kind of, in some ways, the big landscape of metrics that you utilize to go after problems. And I would say we have leveraged, all of those at Microsoft. A few projects or a few highlights that I will talk about that might be relevant to your audience is our HRBI team, business intelligence team, has really incorporated workplace analytics data into their core analytical framework. And they marry it with other data sources that they have, such as our annual poll data. And then they use it to study what leads to the best employee experience. So recently, for example, they did a deep dive piece of work on the onboarding experience for new employees, and they found some really interesting insights there about just how important it is for new employees to have early and regular one-on-ones with their managers in those first 90 days, and that managers who did spend time on that had new employees who were able to create bigger networks faster. And we know from our data that bigger networks inside of an organization is, in almost every case, the most important predictor of ultimate success for a knowledge worker. So that's just a fantastic example of where the HRBI team kind of took all this rich data and applied it to a very specific target that they had, which was how do they onboard new employees more effectively.
I love that. It's not just about doing the job and doing the work itself, but it's about who you know within the organization to be able to collaborate and work with and navigate and connect with.
That's right. Very commonly, this behavioral data is connected with outcomes data or success data. And almost every time that we do that, we find that the network metrics, so the connections that people create inside of their organization, and if they're salespeople, for example, at their customer organizations, are the most powerful predictors for whether or not they'll be successful and engaged and happy at work.
Let's take a bit of a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast. Today we're talking with Natalie McCullough. You can follow Natalie on Twitter at Natalie McCull, or NATALIEMCCULL. Let's get back to it. I've long talked about the biggest impact on an employee's productivity and employee engagement lies in the hands of the direct manager. Can you talk a little bit about how your work in people analytics is helping to support or debunk these assumptions?
The possibilities for understanding manager behavior with people analytics are really strong. And we've done this work at Microsoft, and many of our customers have done this work as well. The key to doing this work is to connect the behavioral data with the employee engagement data, and then to use that to create populations that you can study around what leads to the most engaged employees. And we find some really, really fascinating things. So interesting metrics around managerial behavior that you can get from people analytics data are things like, I mentioned earlier, how much one-on-one time managers are spending with employees. One-on-one time, this fascinates me every time we look at it. It is something that everybody kind of knows is important, but our data shows that more often than not, that's lip service, that almost every company that uses this data finds that their managers are not spending very much one-on-one time with their direct employees. We can also use the data to understand how well managers are balancing workload across teams, and that can be a very strong indicator of happiness or engagement at work. It's not necessarily a function of very high workload or very low workload leads to high engagement. What we see is that when there's high variability across a team, that actually leads to disengagement. So you have people who are maybe putting in, many hours a week into work, and others that are putting in fewer hours. And when they see that disparity, that's actually what creates the challenge. We talked earlier about network size and breadth. One of the interesting metrics that we found over time is the ratio of a manager's network size to his or her employees is actually a really strong indicator of whether the employee feels that the manager will be able to support them as an employee, because that manager's behavior network, that manager's ability to connect to the rest of the organization is one of the most important factors that they have as a manager. Recently, we published a paper, not myself, but my colleagues published a paper in Harvard Business Review about the impact of managers' behaviors around after-hours work. So we studied the behaviors of managers of sending kind of weekend emails or after hours emails or setting up after hours meetings. And we found that when for the managers that were doing those activities, their teams were much more likely to have a high burden of after hours work. So it supported this hypothesis that we had that the manager behavior, they set the tone, and then that behavior radiates across a team in a way that can be, either positive or negative in this case.
One of the things I really liked about the Microsoft People Analytics platform and the technology and the reporting and the data that you guys have is the employee specific data. So as an individual, they can take a look at their habits or activities or where they are spending their time and perhaps come up with a plan of improvement and also take responsibility for their own productivity and engagement. I find that sometimes, in my experience, that people like to place all the responsibility of engagement and productivity on a manager or on the larger organization. And you guys offer, I think, an opportunity for employees to kind of self-reflect and maybe put together their own plan of action to improve. Is that a trend that you guys are seeing, or was that your intention with the reporting and analytics that you built?
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. Most of the examples we've talked about so far have been utilizing workplace analytics to diagnose, population trends, et cetera. But one of the products that people get the most excited about is the My Analytics product, which is kind of that Fitbit for personal work productivity. And our belief here is that we can empower people with a set of data and insights about how they spend their time, how they network with other people, the choices that they make during work that will make them much happier and more productive at work. And we surface that to them in, I think, really interesting and compelling ways. So for the kind of the productivity junkies out there, of which I myself am one, we have a nice dashboard that you can go to, and you can really dive deep into understanding where your time goes. You can look at your quality indicators around meetings. Like my dashboard frequently tells me that I'm multitasking in 15 hours of meetings a week, and meaning like sending lots of emails while I'm in meetings, and should I rethink whether I should be in those meetings or not. And it's just that push to say, like, that's not the right behavior. How can I do it differently? But we also, for people who maybe aren't as oriented towards going in and diving deep into their data, we have a new feature that around behavioral nudges. So we obviously didn't create that concept of a behavioral nudge, but we're really running with it. And that's embedding nice little nudges into the workflow that people have every day when they're inside of Outlook initially. So for example, if I get a meeting invitation and my calendar is really full, a little nudge will come up that says, hey, next week is starting to fill up. Would you like to set aside some focus time? And then it'll give me some options on my calendar. And with sort of a click of a button, I can block off, a 2-hour block next week to make sure that I don't get really filled up with time. And I have a number of examples like that, but that's one of my favorite features of what we're doing with this work, is like really turning this data into insights and easily actionable utilities for individuals.
I really love that, because it's not unlike the function I have on my Apple Watch that reminds me that I need to stand every
up.
hour.
Yes.
Yes. So
Yes,
this is like, hey,
exactly.
by the way, this is your productivity coach speaking. Go ahead, if you would, and block some time out on your calendar next week for some focus time. I think that's a great reminder. One of the last things I wanted to talk to you about is we have all this access to this analytics and data and information, but what are some ways maybe that we can introduce this into our roles in human resources, and maybe specifically when we're having conversations with our executive leadership team?
Yeah, that's a great question. I talk to HR leaders who are at sort of different stages in their analytics journeys. And I think if you're just starting out in your analytics journey, it's important to think through sort of the full life cycle of how you go from data to insight to action and impact. It's not just about the data. Like, getting the data is interesting, but turning that data into a business relevant conversation and a compelling story that inspires the organization to change what's happening is equally important, and sometimes harder than the first part. And so my guidance to HR teams when they're starting this journey onto people analytics is to invest sort of equally in the data science and analytics data analysts that they're going to put onto their team, as well as sort of the business analysts, or we call them workplace leads in our line of work, who can help connect the dots between the data and the business challenges that the business have, and then turn those into compelling stories with actionable so what's that organizations can take.
Awesome. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm a geek when it comes to analytics, and I love that this is moving forward and gaining momentum in the human resource industry. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you do and the work that is happening at Microsoft?
Yeah, we have a fantastic website we created. It's called insights.office.com, and it aggregates all the research that we have published. I think we are at close to 20 articles in Harvard Business Review in the last 3 years. So we've published a lot in different journals to tell people about how they can utilize this this data to drive productivity and engagement in organizations. So that's a really good place to start if you're curious to learn more. And then I'm on, as you said, Twitter and LinkedIn if people want to learn more, connect.
Well, give Natalie a follow on Twitter because she does share a lot of really good resources. I have learned some productivity tools and techniques from some of the articles and things that you've shared over the last week or so.
Thanks, Jessica. It was great to spend time with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. After hearing all this data and analytics we now have at our fingertips, I'm really excited about the future now more than ever for human resources. Microsoft and the work that they are doing helps arm workplace leaders, HR, and individual contributors with the data they need to be more successful throughout the organization. I especially love the work that they are doing focused on knowledge workers and helping to understand not only how to be productive, but how analytics goes hand in hand with any type of organizational transformation, large or small. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.